At my retirement party, the room was filled with friends, coworkers, and my husband who watched me with pride. Then my boss stood up with a glass in his hand and began to speak. What started as a kind farewell quickly turned into a cruel twist, and by the end of his words, my husband's eyes were wet with tears. That night, a celebration turned into the beginning of the hardest chapter of my life. I was 22 when I walked into that building for the first time. My shoes were worn, the kind that hurt more than they helped, and my suit was borrowed from my sister. I remember the way the lobby smelled of strong coffee and old carpet. I remember how my heart pounded as I pressed the elevator button, how the metal doors opened with a groan, and how I stepped inside thinking that this place could become the start of something steady. I wasn't chasing dreams. I wasn't chasing wealth. I was chasing something simpler: security, a paycheck that came every 2 weeks, a chair I could sit in without wondering if someone would pull it away. That was all I wanted. The first weeks were hard. I made mistakes. I stapled the wrong files together, forgot names, spilled coffee on my desk. I stayed quiet, nodded when people spoke, and apologized more than I should have. But I also stayed late. While others packed up at 5, I kept typing. I picked up work no one wanted to finish. Slowly, the faces around me noticed. They stopped asking if I was new. They started leaving their problems on my desk, and I solved them without complaint. I didn't shine. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, the one pitching big ideas. I was the one making sure those big ideas didn't fall apart once the meeting was over. That became my place. Steady, reliable, invisible. Years went by like that. My 20s slipped into my 30s. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, dinners. Daniel, my husband, would wait up for me, sometimes with food wrapped in foil, sometimes with a quiet sigh as he fell asleep on the couch. I told myself it was temporary, that the long hours were a sacrifice for a future where we wouldn't have to worry, but temporary stretched into permanent. And still, I told myself it was worth it. In the office, I built a reputation. People knew me as the one who could be trusted. When a project was on fire, I was the firefighter. When a client threatened to leave, I was the one calming the storm. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't celebrated, but it was constant, and people relied on me more and more because of it. I watched others climb the ladder. I watched them chase promotions, switch departments, move to new cities. Some of them burned out. Some of them failed. I stayed. I became the one who held things together while everyone else reached for the spotlight. And in time, I accepted that role. There is a strange pride in being the one who endures. Not the star, not the leader, but the anchor. The one people turn to when the showy ones stumble. I carried that pride quietly, even when it weighed me down. I told myself loyalty mattered, that if I gave enough, it would come back to me, that if I stayed faithful to the company, if I gave it my years, it would stand by me in return. It sounds naive when I say it now, but back then, it was the truth I lived by. I can still picture the office corridors after hours, the hum of the lights, the sound of my own typing echoing in empty space, the janitor passing by with a nod. I can still taste the cold coffee I drank at midnight, convincing myself it was fuel for progress. I can still feel the weight of files in my arms, stacked so high I could barely see where I was going. Those were my nights, and they became my years. At home, Daniel carried his own weight. He never said much about my hours. He cooked, he cleaned, he kept the house warm. He wanted children, but the timing was never right, and we stopped talking about it after a while. Instead, we built our life around the few hours we had together. Saturday breakfasts, Sunday walks, holidays where I checked my work email under the table. It wasn't the life I promised him, but
It was the life we settled into. I thought he understood. I thought he saw what I was trying to build for us. He told me I was the anchor, that without me, we would drift. I held on to that, even when the distance grew between us. The company became my second home. The people there became my second family. I learned their moods, their habits, their weaknesses. I knew who drank too much, who fought with their spouse, who dreamed of quitting. I knew it all because I was always there, listening, working, observing. And because I was always there, I became easy to overlook. That was fine with me. I didn't need the spotlight. I told myself the reward would come later, in stability, in recognition, in the quiet respect people give to those who have stood the test of time. But loyalty is a dangerous thing when it goes only one way. I didn't see it then. I didn't see how much I was giving without asking for anything in return. I didn't see how that opened the door for others to use me, to lean on me, to build their success on my labor while I stayed in the background. There were days I thought about leaving, times when Daniel asked me if I ever wanted something different, but I always answered the same way. This job is safe, this job is steady, this job will carry us through. I believed it. I clung to it. And year after year, I walked the same halls, sat at the same desk, carried the same weight. Looking back now, I can trace the pattern. Every late night, every missed dinner, every quiet sacrifice. Each one stitched together into a life built on loyalty. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't see, was that loyalty would not protect me in the end. It would be turned against me. Still, at that time, I believed. I believed the company saw me as I was, faithful, steady, essential. I believed Daniel saw me the same way. And I believed that when my time came to step away, I would be honored for what I had given. I didn't yet know that the very things I held onto, the trust, the faith, the quiet sacrifices, would be used as weapons. That the years of invisible work, the very foundation of my identity, would be twisted into something ugly. But in those years, before the cracks showed, I carried myself with quiet certainty. I wore my loyalty like armor, and I thought that made me safe. The night of my retirement came faster than I ever imagined. 35 years compressed into a single evening, wrapped in colored streamers and plastic balloons that read, "Congratulations." The room was dressed in cheer, though I felt strangely out of place within it, as if I were walking into someone else's celebration. I had spent decades in that building, yet sitting in the banquet hall with music playing in the background, I felt like a guest rather than the honoree. People gathered at tables draped with white cloths, their glasses filled, their laughter too loud, almost forced. My coworkers clapped when I entered and I smiled, though the expression felt stiff on my face. I had always been the one who stayed in the background, who worked while others stood in the spotlight. Now the spotlight was fixed on me, and it burned in ways I wasn't prepared for. Daniel sat close to me, his hand resting lightly on mine, his eyes brighter than I'd seen in years. He looked at me with pride, the kind of pride that made my chest ache. His smile was warm, his shoulders straight, his expression unguarded. For a moment, I believed that maybe all the sacrifices had meant something, that he saw them as I had seen them, necessary, noble, worthwhile. His eyes glistened with emotion, and I thought they were tears of joy. I didn't realize how fragile that moment was. The tables filled with chatter. Old coworkers came to shake my hand, some of them faces I hadn't seen in years. They told stories of late nights we had shared, of deadlines met only because I had stayed to finish what others started. Some thanked me. Some laughed about the small habits I had kept, the way I always carried a pen, the way I never left my desk messy. the way I remembered details others forgot. They painted me as dependable, steady, the same way I had always seen myself. Their words were kind, but they carried a weight I didn't quite recognize at the time. I thought of the years behind me, the quiet sacrifices, the hours traded for stability. Sitting there, I felt both full and empty. Full because people remembered, empty because I knew what those memories had cost me. The music played on, a slideshow of old photos appeared on the screen, me as a young woman smiling nervously at my desk, me holding a certificate for an employee award, me surrounded by teams that had come and gone while I remained. People laughed at the hairstyles, at the fashions of past decades. I forced a smile, but inside, I felt the years pressing down like stones. Daniel's hand tightened around mine when my face filled the screen again. His eyes brimmed with tears, and he whispered something I didn't fully hear. Something about being proud of me, about how hard I had worked. I looked at him, at the lines on his face that had deepened while I worked late, at the silver in his hair that had appeared while I was in office hallways.
I thought the tears in his eyes were proof that we had endured together, that he had understood the cost and still chosen to stand by me. I was wrong. As the evening went on, people gave speeches. One after another, coworkers stood to share their thoughts. Some spoke warmly of my loyalty. Others spoke of my quiet strength. Their words were polite, respectful, yet distant, as if they were reciting lines rather than speaking from the heart. I listened, nodding, clapping at the right moments, but inside I felt a strange disconnection, as though I were watching my own life summarized by strangers. Then came the moment that should have been the peak of the night. The room hushed, and my boss stood. Glass in hand, smile broad, his voice carried across the hall with practiced charm. The crowd leaned in. My husband looked at me, his face shining with pride, expecting words of praise to crown the years I had given. I thought I knew what was coming. Words of thanks, a simple acknowledgement of my dedication, something that would make the years feel recognized, even if only in part. I had no way of knowing that his speech would not honor me, that his words would not lift me, but instead strike with such force that the pride in Daniel's eyes would turn to grief. Daniel had stood by me all these years, or so I believed. That night, his eyes shone with pride. I mistook that for love, for shared accomplishment. I didn't know those same eyes would soon be filled with tears of another kind, tears that would cut deeper than silence, deeper than anger. In that room, under the soft glow of celebration, surrounded by voices raised in laughter, I did not yet see the betrayal forming. I only saw my husband smile, his hand on mine, his belief in me. And for a brief, fragile moment, I thought it was enough. When the room finally settled, all eyes turned to him, my boss, the man who had stood above me for decades, the man whose voice could silence a room, the man I had both respected and feared in different ways over the years. He held a glass of champagne in his hand, swirling it slowly, the bubbles catching the light as if even the drink obeyed his rhythm. He smiled the way only someone in control can smile, confident, certain, unshaken. I sat still, Daniel's hand resting in mine, his palm warm, his fingers curled around mine with gentle pride. My coworkers leaned forward, expectant. A hush fell that was almost reverent, as though they were about to witness something important. I thought it would be a kind farewell, a speech about dedication, about years of service, about what I had meant to the company. That's what these nights were supposed to be. That's what retirement speeches always were.
Thank you, goodbye, good luck. He began just that way. His voice rolled smooth, the tone of a practiced speaker. He spoke of my years of loyalty, my steadiness, my long hours. He called me the backbone of the office, the one who never wavered. People nodded, clapped lightly, even laughed when he mentioned how I was always the last to leave, always the one to fix mistakes before anyone else noticed them. For a moment, it sounded like the recognition I had been waiting for. But then something shifted. I heard it first in the rhythm of his voice, the way his words slowed, the way his smile deepened. He paused, letting the silence stretch longer than needed, as if savoring the weight of what he was about to say. My stomach tightened. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a sudden unease, like a shadow passing through the room. And then he said it. She wasn't just the backbone of this company. She was my companion, too. The room froze. A ripple of gasps broke the silence, soft but sharp, spreading from table to table. My ears rang, as if the words had cracked something inside me.
He lifted his glass higher, his eyes locking on Daniel. Daniel, I suppose you should know, after all these years? The words cut through the air, slicing the night apart. My husband's hand slipped from mine. I felt the warmth leave me in an instant, replaced by the cold emptiness of the space between us. I turned to him and saw his face change before my eyes. The pride he had carried all evening shattered. His features collapsed as though the foundation beneath them had been pulled away. His mouth trembled, his eyes filled, and the tears that had once been of pride now brimmed with pain. The room erupted, not in laughter, not in applause, but in murmurs and stifled whispers. Chairs shifted, glasses clinked nervously, and I could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on me. Some looked shocked, others curious, some even smirking with cruel satisfaction, as though gossip had been fed to them like a feast. I sat frozen. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed that it wasn't true, that it was a lie, but my voice wouldn't come. It was a lie, a calculated lie, a weapon disguised as a toast. I knew it the moment I heard it. My boss didn't stumble over his words. He didn't misspeak. He had chosen them carefully, sharpened them, rehearsed them, and delivered them in front of everyone. He wanted the damage to be public. He wanted the cut to go deeper by being witnessed. Daniel's eyes searched mine desperate, broken, unsure, and that was what hurt most. He didn't cry because he believed it. He cried because he didn't know what to believe anymore. Decades of trust and sacrifice shaken in one breath. Pride turned into humiliation. Certainty turned into doubt. I tried to reach for him, but his body pulled away almost instinctively. Not a violent rejection, not an angry shove, but a quiet retreat, as though he couldn't bear the touch of my hand while those words hung in the air. That retreat felt worse than a blow. Around us, the whispers continued. My coworkers leaned toward one another, mouths covered, eyes darting. Some avoided my gaze entirely, unwilling to be caught staring, while others stared openly, almost hungrily, waiting to see what I would do. I wanted to speak. I wanted to stand and tell them all the truth, to shout that it was a lie, that I had never betrayed my husband, that I had never touched that man beyond the polite handshake of an employee. But my throat closed, my voice locked inside, and even if I had spoken, would anyone have believed me in that moment? Lies are heavier than truth when spoken with confidence. My boss lowered his glass and sat back, smug, satisfied, as if he had just delivered the perfect ending to the night. He said no more, didn't explain, didn't laugh, didn't soften the blow. He let the silence do his work for him.
I sat in that silence, surrounded by whispers, with Daniel beside me breaking apart in quiet tears. That was the night everything shifted. The room did not return to normal after his words. No laughter rose to fill the silence, no applause followed the speech. Instead, it fractured into whispers, broken pieces of sound scattered across the tables. People leaned into each other, voices low, eyes flicking in my direction before darting away again. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down on me, thick with suspicion and curiosity. I could feel them studying me, their glances sharp, their expressions unreadable. Some looked at me with pity, others with quiet judgment, and a few with thinly veiled satisfaction, as though they had been waiting for this moment, as though the lie had confirmed something they had long hoped to believe. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to speak, unable to defend myself against something so carefully delivered, so ruthlessly simple. Daniel's hand no longer touched mine. It rested instead on his lap, clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles were white. His jaw quivered, his lips pressed together as if holding back words he could not bear to say in front of them all. When I turned to him, his eyes avoided mine, fixed on some distant point across the room. It was not anger I saw in his face, but something quieter, more painful. Confusion, doubt, humiliation. He stood before I could stop him. The scrape of his chair against the floor cut through the murmurs, drawing even more attention to us. He didn't look at me, didn't say anything. To the room, he simply walked out, shoulders rigid, head low, as if he were trying to escape the weight of all those eyes. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud that sounded far louder than it should have.
I remained seated, my body stiff, my breath shallow. For a few seconds, I convinced myself I should stay, that leaving would look like guilt, that silence would protect me. But the whispers swelled, filling the empty space left by Daniel's absence, and I knew I couldn't sit there any longer. I rose slowly, my chair tipping slightly behind me. I forced myself to walk past the tables, past the faces that turned toward me with curiosity and disbelief. No one spoke to me, no one reached out. They only watched. Their silence was louder than any words could have been. Outside, the night air was cool, sharp, a relief after the suffocating heat of the hall. I spotted Daniel ahead of me, already moving toward the car. His steps were quick, his shoulders tight, his movements restless. I wanted to call his name, but my voice caught in my throat. By the time I found it, he was already inside, the door slamming shut behind him. I slipped into the passenger seat a moment later. The interior was dark, the smell of leather mixed with his cologne. He didn't look at me, didn't start the car right away. He sat gripping the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles still pale, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The silence between us was thick, almost unbearable. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell him it wasn't true, that the words spoken inside that hall were lies, sharpened to wound. But I couldn't, because in his silence, in the way he refused to meet my eyes, I understood that it wasn't about belief or disbelief anymore. It was about doubt, and doubt, once planted, spreads quickly. The drive home was wordless. The tires hummed against the pavement, the engine droned, but between us there was nothing. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, afraid to reach for him, afraid to break the fragile thread holding us in the same space. Streetlights passed in flashes across his face, illuminating the pain in his expression. Each flicker of light revealed more than words ever could. His pride shattered, his certainty broken, his trust shaken. I turned my head toward the window, watching the blur of houses and empty streets. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, tired, pale, a woman unrecognizable to herself. I thought of the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, the loyalty I had carried like armor.
And I thought of how easily it had all been undone. Betrayal doesn't always come from an enemy. Sometimes it's delivered by the very hands you spent decades serving. That night, as the car carried us home in silence, I realized the truth I had avoided for too long. Loyalty is only as strong as the person who holds it, and mine had been placed in the wrong hands.
The house felt unfamiliar that night. It was the same front door we had unlocked for 30 years, the same worn carpet in the hallway, the same framed photos on the walls. But when we stepped inside, the air felt different, heavy, unwelcoming, as though even the walls had absorbed what had been said, carrying it into every corner. Daniel walked in first, still silent, setting his keys on the table with more force than usual. He didn't slam them down, not quite, but the sharp sound carried through the room. I followed quietly, closing the door behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him from across the living room as he sat down heavily on the couch, his shoulders hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaling through his fingers. I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell him it wasn't true, that I had never betrayed him, that the words spoken at the party had been nothing but poison. But the space between us was too wide, and his silence felt like a wall I couldn't climb. So I busied myself instead. I hung up my coat, smoothed out the fabric, placed my shoes by the door in neat lines, little habits of order I had kept all my life, as though tidiness could fix the mess inside me. When I finally moved into the living room, Daniel didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, on some invisible spot only he could see. I sat at the other end of the couch, leaving space between us, careful not to push closer. The silence stretched. It wasn't peaceful silence, not the kind we had shared many nights after long days. This silence had edges. It cut at me with every second. "Daniel," I said softly. My voice felt thin, unsteady. He didn't answer, not at first. He shifted, leaning back, staring up at the ceiling. His hands fell into his lap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I don't know why he'd say that. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. It was a statement of disbelief, spoken more to himself than to me. But the way he said it, slow, heavy, carried a weight I had never heard in his voice before. I swallowed, forcing myself to answer, "Because it's not true, because he wanted to hurt me." Daniel nodded faintly, but his eyes stayed on the ceiling. He didn't look at me. That distance, that quiet refusal to meet my gaze, hurt more than any words could have. I sat there, hands clasped in my lap, searching for something more to say. Nothing came. The house around us felt too loud in its quiet. The tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the wooden frame. All of it seemed sharper now, reminders of the emptiness between us. That night, he went to bed early. He didn't touch my hand, didn't kiss my forehead the way he used to. He just climbed beneath the covers, turned his back to me, and closed his eyes. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night over and over. Why did he say it? Why then? Why there? I could still hear his voice, sharp and deliberate. The smug pause, the cruel precision of his words. Those weren't careless remarks. They had been sharpened, rehearsed, delivered with intention. He had wanted Daniel to hear them. He had wanted the room to hear them. He had wanted me broken. But why? I thought back on the years I had worked under him, the way he relied on me, trusted me to keep things running smoothly, The long hours, the weekends, the quiet sacrifices no one else noticed. For decades, I had been loyal, not just to the company, but to him as my superior. I had never crossed lines, never blurred boundaries. I had kept my head down and done the work. So why, after all these years, would he choose to humiliate me on the night meant to honor me? I turned onto my side, watching Daniel's back as he slept or pretended to sleep. His breathing was steady, but his body was tense, as though, even in rest, he couldn't release the weight of what he had heard. My chest ached with the distance already growing between us. Loyalty. That word echoed in my mind. I had given it freely. To my company, to my boss, to my marriage. I had believed loyalty was the foundation of everything. But loyalty, I was beginning to understand, meant nothing to those who chose to betray it. And betrayal doesn't always come from an enemy. Sometimes it comes from the very hands you thought you could trust. That night, lying in the dark, I realized the cracks had already formed, not in the walls of our home, but in the bond between Daniel and me. And those cracks had been carved not by me, but by a man who knew exactly how to wound. Sleep didn't come easily that night. My body lay still, but my mind wandered back through the years, tracing paths I had long left buried. When someone wounds you so deliberately, you begin to search for the reasons. You replay the history, searching for the cracks that might explain the attack. I remembered the first time I stood up to him. It was many years ago, when I was still young enough to be uncertain, still new enough to worry about keeping my job. A client account had been mishandled by one of the managers, and instead of fixing it honestly, my boss wanted me to adjust the paperwork, to hide the mistake. He said it quickly, casually, as though it were nothing more than rearranging numbers. I remember sitting in his office, the blinds half closed, the air smelling faintly of stale coffee. He leaned back in his chair, watching me, waiting for me to obey. My heart pounded, my palms sweaty against the folder I held. It would have been so easy to nod, to do what he asked, to avoid confrontation. But something inside me resisted. I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "That's not right." His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening just slightly. It was the first time I saw the shadow of his temper. He didn't explode and didn't shout, but he never forgot. Years later, there were more moments. Times when he tried to push me into silence, into complicity. A younger colleague, barely out of college, came to me once in tears. He had cornered her in the break room, spoken words she shouldn't have had to hear. She wanted to quit, to walk away before her career had even begun. I sat with her, listened, and promised I would say something. I did. I went to him, told him it wasn't acceptable, told him she deserved respect, not intimidation. His smile faded as I spoke, that same tightness returning to his face. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand, but I knew, again, he would not forget. There were smaller battles too, times when he wanted to cut corners, times when he wanted loyalty without question, and each time I drew a line. Not loudly, not with rebellion, but firmly. Quiet resistance, a refusal to be controlled. I see it clearly now, looking back from this distance. Each no planted a seed. Each act of defiance, however small, grew into something larger in his mind. Resentment doesn't always appear suddenly. It builds, layer upon layer, until one day it demands release. That night at the party wasn't about me. Not really. It wasn't about love or loyalty or even the truth. It was about control. He was a man nearing the end of his power. Retirement was not only mine, it was coming for him too.
The years had taken their toll, the respect he once commanded no longer unquestioned. And what do men like him do when they feel power slipping from their hands? They lash out. They destroy what they can so that no one walks away clean. I understood then. He didn't care who he destroyed. My career, my marriage, my life, all of it could burn, as long as it meant he still held the match. And he chose that night, my night, to strike the final blow.
The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Daniel barely spoke to me in those days. His words, when they came, were short, practical. He asked about dinner, about the mail, about small things. Never about what mattered. Never about that night. So I filled the silence with work of my own. While he sat in front of the television, his eyes on the moving pictures but his thoughts elsewhere, I slipped into the study. It was the same desk I had worked at for years, the same drawers filled with files and folders, the same old computer humming with age. I closed the door softly and sat down, my hands resting on the keyboard. I began to search, not for comfort, not for forgiveness, for truth. I pulled up old emails, correspondence stretching back years. I scrolled through archived folders, through spreadsheets and reports most people would have deleted long ago. I read late into the night, my eyes burning, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. At first, it felt desperate, aimless, like grasping in the dark for something that might not even exist. But then patterns began to appear, small things, numbers that didn't add up, approvals signed too quickly, accounts closed without proper explanation. I remembered times when I had questioned figures, only to be waved off, times when I had been told not to worry, that it was handled. Back then, I let it go. I was loyal. I trusted. But now, reading those numbers again, I saw them for what they were, cover-ups. I dug deeper, cross-checked reports, matched dates, followed trails of transactions hidden beneath jargon. Piece by piece, the picture began to form. Money shifted quietly. Accounts padded, then drained. Bonuses disguised as expenses. Deals that never quite existed. And behind it all, his name. My boss. That's when it struck me. His speech at the party, the lie he told so easily, wasn't random cruelty. It was strategy. A move on the board. If I retired clean, with my reputation intact, I could have gone back. I could have asked questions. I could have spoken out. My years of records, my memory, my steadiness, it all made me dangerous. I knew too much, even if I didn't realize it. So he discredited me first. He poisoned my marriage, shattered my image, tainted my name in front of everyone who might one day listen to me. He didn't just want me gone, he wanted me silenced. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it settling in. This wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about bitterness. It was survival. His survival. He had built his career on numbers that weren't clean, on deals that weren't real, and he couldn't risk me pulling the thread that would unravel it all. I sat there for hours, the documents spread across my desk, my eyes scanning line after line. Each discovery was a nail hammered into the coffin of my old loyalty. Each number, each email, each false signature tore away the last remnants of the respect I had once carried for him. Revenge is never loud at first. It's quiet, patient, a slow burn. And as the night stretched on, I understood what he had done. And I understood what I needed to do. It was late when he finally spoke. The kind of late when the house is silent, when the night presses against the windows, when words can no longer be avoided. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting a pale glow across his face. His shoulders slumped, his hands folded loosely in front of him. He looked older than I remembered, as if the weeks since the party had stolen years from him. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him in silence, unsure if I should step closer or leave him to his thoughts. Finally, his voice broke the stillness. I don't know what to believe anymore. The words were soft, but they carried the weight of everything between us. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse me, didn't shout. He simply spoke the truth of his heart, raw, fragile, uncertain. I felt it like a blade, not because he said it, but because I understood. Doubt is the sharpest wound of all. I wanted to rush to him, to grab his hands and pour out everything I had found in those long nights at the desk. The files, the numbers, the proof that it was all a lie. But the evidence was still scattered, incomplete, not yet strong enough to fight with. And so I swallowed the ache in my throat, blinked away the sting in my eyes, and sat down across from him. For a while, neither of us spoke. We only sat there, the silence broken by the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. My hands gripped the edge of the table, grounding myself. His eyes were tired, watery, the look of a man who wanted so desperately to hold on but couldn't. When I finally found my voice, it trembled but did not break. Then I'll give you something to believe. He looked at me then, really looked, not with anger, not with certainty, but with the hollow gaze of a man lost in fog.
I continued, softer. I'll prove it to you. I'll prove that it isn't true. I'll prove that he lied, that he used me, used us. Daniel said nothing. He nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, then lowered his eyes again. But I saw it, just a flicker of hope, buried beneath the doubt. And that was enough. In his doubt, I saw my own reflection. How many times had I doubted myself over the years? How many times had I swallowed lies, stayed quiet, chosen peace over truth? Too many. No more. I owed him the truth. I owed myself revenge. The nights grew longer after Daniel's confession. I could feel the space between us widening, like two boats drifting apart on dark water. He didn't accuse me again, but his silence said enough. His doubt lived in the room with us, sitting at the dinner table, lingering in the hallway, following me into bed. So while he slept, I worked. The study became my refuge. The desk, once cluttered with the ordinary tools of a long career, became a battleground. Folders spread across the surface, papers stacked in uneven towers, sticky notes filled with dates and initials. The hum of the computer was my only companion, the blue glow of the screen washing over me deep into the night. At first, it felt like I was reaching into the dark, grasping at threads that might never connect. But slowly, a shape began to form. Numbers that didn't add up, reports with the same phrases repeated, as though copied and pasted to hide the truth. Approvals signed with a flourish that wasn't his own handwriting. I traced expenses back to accounts that didn't exist. I found bonuses given to names I didn't recognize, people who had left long before the dates showed. I remembered asking him about one of those reports years ago, confused about a consultant I had never met. He had smiled, patted my arm and said, "Don't worry, I handled it." Back then, I believed him. Now, I knew better. The deeper I looked, the more I realized the scale of it. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a system. Years of small lies layered on top of each other until they formed something bigger than anyone dared question. But documents alone weren't enough. I needed voices. I needed people who had seen what I had seen, who had felt his power press down on them. So I started making calls. The first one was to Linda, a woman who had left quietly 5 years earlier. I remembered the way she packed her desk, her face pale, her hands shaking as she filled a cardboard box. No goodbye party, no farewell lunch, just gone. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was wary at first, flat, as though she didn't want to be pulled back into that world. But when I mentioned his name, there was a pause. And then her words spilled out like a dam breaking. "He ruined me," she said. "I wouldn't. I couldn't." She stopped, took a breath, and started again. "He called me into his office one night, said he wanted to mentor me. I told him no. The next week, my projects were reassigned. My evaluations suddenly turned negative. They told me I wasn't a team player. I had to leave." Her voice trembled, but it was steady enough for me to hear the truth in it. I wrote down every word. Next, I called Mark. He had been sharp, ambitious, the kind of employee everyone thought would climb fast. Instead, he disappeared one summer, leaving without explanation. When he answered, his tone was clipped, guarded. "Why are you bringing this up?" he asked. "Because I need to know. Because I think he's done to others what he did to me." There was a long silence. I could hear the faint sound of traffic through his phone. Then, finally, he spoke. "He made me sign off on numbers that were fake. Said it was just a temporary fix, that the real contracts would come in later. They never did. When I refused the second time, he gave me a choice: sign or leave. I left." His bitterness was sharp, but beneath it I heard relief. Relief that someone finally asked. Each call gave me more proof, more details, more weight to the story I was building. Some people were hesitant, afraid to put their name to anything. Others spoke with anger that hadn't dulled with time. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. It wasn't just fraud. It wasn't just harassment. It was manipulation woven into the fabric of the company, held together by fear and silence. And at the center of it all, him. I saved everything, every email, every file, every testimony. I backed them up on flash drives, hid copies in the house where no one would find them. I printed pages and locked them in a metal box under the bed. Paranoid, maybe, but I knew what he was capable of, and I wasn't going to give him the chance to erase it all. And through it all, I thought of Daniel, his words echoing in my mind. I don't know what to believe anymore. I wasn't just gathering evidence for myself. I was gathering it for him. For the man who had stood by me through decades of late nights and missed dinners, who had held me up when I was too tired to stand, who had doubted me now only because someone had poisoned him with lies. I wanted to give him something solid, something undeniable, proof that would erase the doubt, proof that would show him who I really was and who my boss had always been. But more than that, I wanted to give the truth back to everyone who had lost it. To Linda, to Mark, to every name I wrote in the margins of my notes. People who had been silenced, ignored, destroyed. Piece by piece, I assembled the truth. Not just for Daniel, but for every person that man had ever silenced. The day of the board meeting arrived quietly, without fanfare. No balloons this time, no cake, no champagne, no photographs lined up for company newsletters. Just a long table, heavy folders, and faces drawn tight with suspicion. I had sent the evidence anonymously at first. Documents, testimonies, numbers that spoke louder than my voice ever could. Then, when I knew they had no choice but to take it seriously, I signed my name. 35 years in that place. And for once, the truth would carry my signature instead of his. The press picked it up almost instantly. I didn't have to make calls. The papers spoke for themselves. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. Reporters swarmed the story. Headlines ran bold across front pages. Executive misconduct allegations surface. Financial discrepancies uncovered. Questions raised about longtime CEO. He tried to deny it at first, of course. He walked into that meeting with the same smug smile he wore at my retirement party, the same air of control. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his jacket, as if presentation alone could erase the words printed in black and white. But this time, the room wasn't his. I sat at the end of the table, not as an employee, not as a victim, but as a witness. My hands folded neatly in my lap, my face calm. Inside, my heart pounded, but I didn't let it show. I had spent years keeping my emotions hidden at work. This was no different. One by one, the documents were read aloud: expense reports, testimonies, accounts that had been buried for years. The board members looked from paper to paper, their eyes narrowing, their pens scribbling notes. Each page stripped him of the authority he had built. Each fact chipped away at the mask he wore.
And then came the testimonies. The voices of those he had silenced, their words filled the room like ghosts returned to demand justice. Stories of harassment, of intimidation, of careers destroyed for refusing him. For years, those voices had been whispers in the shadows. Now they were loud, unignorable. I didn't smile, I didn't clap, I just sat there, listening, as the man who had humiliated me in front of my husband, in front of my friends, in front of the company I had given my life to, finally faced his own reckoning. When the chairman of the board cleared his throat and said the words, "Effective immediately, you are removed from your position," I didn't flinch. He did. His jaw tightened, his hands gripped the edge of the table. For the first time, the confidence cracked. His voice rose, desperate, accusing others, trying to spread the blame. But the room was no longer his. The tide had turned, and he was drowning in it. I thought of that night at the party. The clinking of glasses, the laughter cut short by his lie, the way Daniel's hand slipped from mine. I thought of the silence in the car, the distance in our home, the weight of betrayal heavy on my shoulders. This moment was the mirror image. Back then, he had taken control of the room with a single sentence, a weapon disguised as praise. Now he was undone by the truth, delivered not in whispers, but in pages and voices he could no longer silence. When they escorted him out, cameras flashing, questions shouted, his face pale and drawn, I felt no triumph, no victory, only clarity, detached, resilient, understood. The night after the board meeting, the house felt different, lighter somehow, though nothing had changed. The same walls stood around us, the same photographs lined the shelves, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Yet the air no longer pressed down on me. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, his eyes fixed on the wood grain as though it held the answers he had been searching for. He didn't look up when I entered. For a moment, I thought he might stay silent again, let the gap between us stretch wider. But then he spoke. "I saw the reports," he said. His voice was low, steady, but heavy. "I read every word. I should have trusted you." I stood in the doorway, watching the man who had once been my anchor, the man whose doubt had cut deeper than any of my boss's lies. His shoulders slumped, his face drawn with regret. I was weak. When he said those things at the party, I told myself it couldn't be true. But then, I saw the way people looked at us. I saw the way you froze. And I let that doubt grow. I let it live between us. His words were like stones laid bare on the table, each one heavier than the last. I walked to the chair across from him and sat. For a long while, we said nothing. The quiet wasn't sharp this time. It wasn't filled with suspicion. It was the quiet of two people trying to find their way back. Finally, I spoke. Trust once broken is never whole, but it can be patched, imperfectly, with truth, with scars, with time.
"I'm sorry," he whispered, "for doubting you, for leaving you alone in that moment. The apology didn't erase the pain. It didn't erase the nights I spent hunched over files, proving my worth not to strangers, but to the man who had promised to believe in me. But it was a start, I reached across the table, placed my hand over his. For a second, he hesitated. Then his fingers curled around mine, warm and familiar, though marked now by something new. Not the blind trust of before, not the easy comfort of untested years, but something harder, more fragile, more real. We sat there hand in hand in the quiet of our kitchen. No grand speeches, no sudden mending of everything broken, just the beginning of something honest. And that was enough. The lake was still that evening, the surface unbroken, a mirror of fading light. The cabin sat behind me, small and quiet, its wooden walls carrying none of the noise of my old life. No phones, no files, no whispers of betrayal, only silence. Only the sound of water brushing against the shore. I sat on the porch, watching the sky shift from gold to deep orange, then to violet. The colors bled slowly, each one fading into the next, like the chapters of a long story closing. I thought of the night of my retirement party, the clinking glasses, the sudden silence, Daniel's hand slipping from mine, my boss's voice, sharp and cruel, slicing through everything I thought I had built. I thought of the whispers that followed, the car ride home, the long nights when doubt filled the spaces between us. I lost faith that night, faith in my company, faith in my husband, faith in myself. But betrayal has a strange way of carving paths you never would have chosen. From betrayal came clarity. I saw the truth about the man who had held power over me for decades. I saw the truth about the silence I had endured, the compromises I had made, the years I had spent putting others above myself. And I saw the truth about Daniel, not as the perfect partner I once believed him to be, but as a man capable of weakness, of doubt, of breaking and mending. From revenge came peace. Not the peace of forgetting or of pretending it had never happened, but the peace of knowing I had faced it, fought it, turned the lie back on the one who had spoken it. For once, the silence was not mine to keep. The sun slipped lower, kissing the water. The reflection shimmered, then scattered as a breeze rippled across the surface. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Some sunsets mark endings, others mark freedom. I sat there until the last light sank below the horizon, the sky turning dark, the first stars appearing above the lake. And for the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down on me. No lies, no doubts, no silence left unspoken. Only stillness. Only freedom. At my retirement party, my boss said something that made my husband cry. But in the end, it wasn't me who left broken. It was him. If this story moved you, share it. Leave your thoughts below and join me for the next chapter.